Good evening. Tonight I'm going to be talking about obsession. What is obsession? It's defined in the dictionary as the state of being obsessed with someone or something. Ooh, now hang on. I think I might be on the wrong. Oh, no, I'm not. It's all good. It's all good. So it's the state of being obsessed with something or someone. It's also an idea or thought that continually preoccupies or intrudes on a person's mind. So it doesn't have to only be a love obsession, it can be many other types of obsession. So I'm going to start with love because that often is the most common obsession to be found in literature. But there are others, and I'd love to know your thoughts on obsessions in books. If you've got any favourites, do tell me what they are. And you might, I'm sure, know some books and stories that I don't know about. So do let me know. Pop them into the Instagram chat or send me a message on Facebook as well. Or you can also tweet me. So I'm going to start off by talking about obsession in the novel Cure, because I realised that me and Susan Elderkin, I think, wrote about it quite well when we published the novel Cure 10 years ago. The truth is that the obsessed do not want to be cured. What they fear most is an end to their obsession and to this heightened experience of life. For Aschenbach in Death in Venice, the 3 or 4 hours he spends each day sitting on the beach watching Tadzio at play, and then stalking the boy and his sisters through the increasingly fetid streets of cholera-ridden Venice, are far too dear to him to give up. So, as you can see, our cure for obsession is Death in Venice. Except we do tell you that it's not a cure because the obsessed don't want to be cured, as we all know. He goes to bed at 9 o'clock because once Tadzio has left the scene, there's nothing to stay awake for. Indeed, he can no longer imagine life without the grey-eyed boy with his captivating smile. He knows that the responsible thing to do would be to warn Tadzio's mother about the sickness invading Venice, then lay his hand for the first and last time on Tadzio's head and say goodbye. For by not warning her, he is risking Tadzio's death from the cholera epidemic, as well as his own. But he knows that such an act would break the spell, restore him to himself, the reasonable Aschenbach of old, and he will not do it. Part of what keeps the obsession alive is that Tadzio is Polish and Aschenbach can't understand anything he says, so that what might be the sheerest commonplace is elevated in Aschenbach's ear to the realms of music. When Tadzio emerges from the sea, his wet curls lit by the sun, nothing that he shouts out to his siblings on the beach can ruin it. In Aschenbach's eyes, he's the real thing, a tender young god. Moby Dick assumes mythological proportions too. The crew have heard the rumours and seen how the whale possesses their own tormented Captain Ahab. Here's Moby Dick. Always amazed at how small this book looks. It's because it's got incredibly thin and thin pages and tiny writing. We all know that it's an epic book. Moby Dick. The whale possesses their own tormented Captain Ahab for a long time before they encounter the great Leviathan himself. When they finally glimpse him, they see only parts, a hump or a tail, a hot jet of vapour blasted into the sky, while the full terrors of his vast shadowy bulk remain submerged. Moby Dick's inscrutability gives him power over the crew of the Pequod, and Ahab's inscrutability gives him power over them too. Ishmael doesn't even set eyes on the captain until several days into the voyage, and even then, it's a moody, stricken Ahab he sees, so caught up in his own interior claims as to be unapproachable. But how else, other than with sheer charisma, Could Ahab have persuaded his crew to pursue Moby Dick, even when the boat was full to capacity with blubber already, enough to make them all rich, and when to carry on meant almost certain death? For they are compelled by one that is himself compelled. Such is the power of obsession. Someone in the grip of an obsession is often filled with a strange charisma, as in Moby Dick. To the reader of Death in Venice, Tadzio is just a boy, but Moby Dick is never just a whale, and Captain Ahab is never just a man. When Ahab and Moby Dick disappear together beneath the great shroud of the sea, their mutual charisma doesn't die. Something vast, tantalizing, terrible still remains just out of reach. And so the power to obsess is transferred from the whale to the novel, because perhaps more than any other novel in literary history, Moby Dick has the ability to hook readers in a way that keeps them coming back throughout their lives. If Aschenbach had been able to know Tadzio, if Ahab had been able to know his whale, if the crew of the Pequod had been able to know Ahab, if the reader of Moby Dick were able to know Moby Dick, if Herman Melville. But what's the use? You won't want to know how to overcome an obsession, for being already obsessed, you don't want to be cured. I wonder if any of you have been in the throes of an obsession in recent years, or if you remember being in an obsession, in an obsessive state, perhaps in your teens or 20s. And if so, was anything going to cure it? Possibly reading other books in which there are obsessions can be quite helpful. And I'm going to read to you next a bit about infatuation, because infatuation and obsession are pretty close to each other. And me and Susan love this book, Jean Cocteau's Les Enfants Terribles, which is about an infatuation and maybe an obsession as well. So I'm just going to find you the passage in the novel Cure, which is all about infatuation. And this is a book I read probably in my teens. I read it when I was 17, studying A levels. The fantastic Mark Moore gave us this book to read. He was our English teacher at the time, and it wasn't on the curriculum. That was in the days that you could give people books that weren't on the curriculum, and it's kind of quite a life-changing book. It's pretty mad, and it is all about infatuation and obsession. I'm just going to read to you a bit from the novel Cure about infatuation. There is nothing so heady, so sweet, or so intoxicating as being in the throes of a serious crush. Whoever your love object, to be lost in the admiration of a fellow being is one of the most absorbing and deliriously pleasurable ways to lose great chunks of your life. But for all the pleasure of this state, there is a price to pay. The love object may well not feel the same way, and by its very nature, infatuation is blind to practicalities. It is an unreasoned, extravagant love, feeding off itself more than off the returned affections of the love recipient. And though not as dangerous as obsession, it can be a precursor to this state, rendering the sufferer incapable of seeing their own folly and the inadequacies of their object. Cocteau's enigmatic little novel is a paradigm of intoxication. That's this, originally written in French. Um, it illustrates a perfectly puzzling love maze in which a brother and sister score points by transferring their infatuation with each other to other young men and women, then back again. Paul and Elizabeth, who are the brother and sister, nurse their mother in a Parisian apartment with one huge room, so that it's rather like a stage. Eventually, they are left alone there, with their imaginations and neuroses to grow like hothouse flowers. At school, Paul has been infatuated with Dargalos, a beautiful boy who threw a snowball at him with a stone inside it. Quite an intriguing way to express your love. This sends the delicate Paul to bed for several weeks, where, as an invalid enjoying the sweet delights of sickness, he learns to love his sister a little too much. On recovery, he meets Agatha, who closely remembers Dargalos, and Paul transfers his infatuation to her. But meanwhile, Paul and Elizabeth have perfected the game, a means of deepening their relationship by wounding each other in a series of circling conversational attacks. As their mutual infatuation becomes more extreme, they withdraw from the world into a make believe existence where all that matters is the game. I wonder if there's any of you that have read this book who are watching tonight. It is a very intense, beautifully written, and illustrated book, which has illustrations by Jean Cocteau, who was also a rather fantastic artist. And who would not be in love with Dargalos looking like that, I ask you? Let me show you a few other pictures. I love the way Cocteau captures the teenage look of being completely self-absorbed and infatuated at the same time. But you can see they're really lovely line drawings. And Jean Cocteau is actually one of my top artists that I love to emulate. It cannot but end badly. It is all too heady, too intense, and prismatically refractive. And it's only a matter of time before we hear the shatter. If you're in the throes of a similarly intense infatuation, switch the object of your fascination from life to the page. Cocteau was known in, it's easier said than done, I suspect, but it can help. Cocteau was known in the artistic circles of his time, whose members included Picasso, Modigliani, Proust, and Gide, as the frivolous prince, and inspired infatuation many times himself. His sensual prose and mercurial imagination are equally ravishing. Les Enfants Terribles was written during a period of withdrawal from opium, and you can feel the call of his blood for the drug in each heightened sentence. The world owes its enchantment to curious creatures and their fancies, he muses. Thistledown spirits, tragic, heartrending in their evanescence, they must go blowing headlong to perdition. Don't let yourself be blown to perdition by currents of whimsical desire. The pleasure to be found in aesthetic heights will last forever. Your mortal crush will not. That's quite harsh, isn't it? But that's what me and Suze wrote a decade ago in the novel Cure. So that was our cure for infatuation. I also want to talk to you about love sickness, unrequited love, and other love forms of infatuation and obsession. But also we will be talking about other types of obsession, such as the obsession for porcelain, which Bruce Chatwin wrote about in this lovely book, Utz. But I'd also love to hear from you if you have any particularly fascinating obsessions or novels that you've read which are about obsessions. Do let me know. Moving on, continuing with the theme of love and issues to do with love and obsession, I'm now going to read to you about love sickness. And our cure for that in the novel Cure is the brilliant book The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith, who also wrote the fantastic book The Talented Mr. Ripley and a whole series of other superb books on the same theme. So we've got love sickness and we've also got unrequited love, all of which are offshoots of obsession. So there's a lot to be said in the world of literature about obsession and love obsession and unrequited love and so on. But I'm just going to read to you about The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith, which is an absolutely brilliant book and a favourite of mine. In the Middle Ages, literary heroes and heroines regularly pined away from love sickness. I love the way people in Chaucerian tales used to pine away like flowers and slowly sink to their knees, going paler and paler, and literally fading away, all because of love. Does that still happen? I bet it does in real life. Palamon in Chaucer's The Knight's Tale is a prime example, having caught sight of fair Emily through the window of the tower where he's imprisoned. They're nearly wasting away from the effects of seeing but not having her. It's only in our less romantic era that psychiatrists tend to be called in and drugs prescribed, which maybe is a bit of a shame. Who wants to be saved by drugs when you could be saved by literature instead? Love sickness is caused by the absence of the loved one, whether it's through enforced separation, rejection by the love object, or death of the loved one. An extreme example. Symptoms can be remarkably palpable, including fainting, wasting away, withdrawal from life, and addiction to chocolate. All of these afflictions can be most tiresome for one's friends and family, and they should see family coping with. Our drug-free cure is a bracing dose of love requited. And there's a little footnote in the book there, because we do love a footnote, saying, we apologise for giving the game away, but this is a novel that is not spoilt by knowing that the girl gets the girl in the end. So this is one of the few novels, The Price of Salt, where a gay couple come to a happy ending, particularly as it was written in the 1950s. And in those days, it tended to be all too frequently the case that the gay couples didn't do so well in novels. Highsmith's second novel was inspired by an incident in her own life when she was working in a department store selling children's dolls, just like Therese in The Price of Salt. She was so bowled over by a customer who seemed to give off light and made her feel that she had seen a vision that she went home and wrote the bones of the story in 2 hours. 2 hours, writers out there. Be inspired by that possibility that you could write the bones of your novel in only 2 hours. The tale told is one of unexpected passion between two women. Carol in her 30s with a daughter and a husband she's in the process of leaving, and Therese, 19, drifting from job to job but with a flair for set design. Is Therese the shop girl who initiates their affair? At first, Therese is openly besotted, and Carol remains playfully cool. Therese's boyfriend is disconcerted. She's made no attempt to hide her obsession from him. See, it's an obsession. It's not just lovesickness. It's worse than being lovesick, he tells her, because it's so completely unreasonable, failing to believe in the possibility of same-sex love. But what is true love but the triumph of emotion over reason? When Carol and Therese take off on a road trip across the States, Carol opens up to Therese and they become fully entwined. Their sensual romance is exquisitely described. The dusky and faintly sweet smell of her perfume came to Therese again, a smell suggestive of dark green silk that was hers alone. She wanted to thrust the table aside and spring into her arms, to bury her nose in the green and gold scarf that was tied close about her neck. During a period when the two are apart, they believe forever, Therese experiences extreme lovesickness, total lassitude and despair in good old medieval style. Love a bit of medieval lovesickness. How would the world come back to life? How would its salt come back? Only Carol can save her from her lovesick state, and she does. Whatever your sexual persuasion, Therese's endurance of her lovesickness will give you strength. If you have a Carol in your life, pursue her. The salt will soon come back. If you give up hope, see love, doomed love, unrequited love, and broken heart. So that's The Price of Salt, which is an absolutely fantastic book by Patricia Highsmith, which I would utterly recommend to anyone that hasn't read it. It's beautifully written and it's a happy love story without giving too much away. They obviously do go through lots of trials and tribulations, but they get together in the end, which is a lovely thing, particularly for a gay love story of that era, as it did always tend to be the case that the gay love stories ended badly back in those days, very sadly. I've also got some good cures for unrequited love, which relate to obsession because when you have an obsession, it can often be the case that it's not a requited situation. It's an obsession that's going on perhaps in secret, or it might only be one way. So we have Cures for Unrequited Love, which are Bel Canto by Anne Patchett, The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, and First Love by Ivan Turgenev. And all of those are fantastic cures. I'm not going to read you the whole passage from the novel Cure because it's quite long, but I will just read you the beginning because it's quite a nice description of unrequited love and its cures. Unrequited love is a particular kind of love that can only ever go one way. To prove our point, we'll borrow Anne Patchett's definition of it in her novel Bel Canto, which is also one of our cures for looking for Mr. or Mrs. Right. Trapped in adjacent seats on an 18-hour flight, the young Swedish accompanist to the famous soprano Roxanne Cox blurts out a confession of undying adoration that makes the singer wince. Coming out of the blue and without any basis in mutual friendship or attraction, it is too much, too soon, and stinks of recklessness. The kind of love that offers its life so easily, so stupidly, is always the love that is not returned. Patchett writes, how can the object of your love see someone worth loving in return when you're willing to throw yourself at their feet, exposed and bleeding like a piece of uncooked meat? That's quite a horrible image, isn't it? But effective. It's only a matter of time before the accompanist sacrifices himself, literally, for the poor sot is well and truly lost to the masochistic destructiveness of his hopeless love. When the terrorists who have taken both the soprano and their audience hostage offer freedom to anyone needing medical help, the love-struck man keeps mum, even though he's a diabetic, requiring regular injections of insulin to stay alive. Oh my God, he totally sacrifices himself and doesn't take his medicine because he's sacrificing himself for the woman he loves. Staying to protect Roxanne will mean certain death. Well, thanks a lot, Swedish accompanist, for dumping the guilt of your death on my hands. Roxanne would be within her right to point out. You call that love? So that is Bel Canto, which is an absolutely brilliant book. If you haven't read it, I would totally urge you to read it immediately. It's got love, it's got obsession, it's got art, music, thoughts about translation, because there's a really important translator character. And it's actually a very cathartic book. So I do think it is a good cure for your unrequited love if you are going through that situation. But I'm just going to have a break from reading things out from the novel Cure, much though I'm enjoying it. But I want to talk to you about a couple of different types of obsession. So we've had Moby Dick, which is an obsession with a whale because Captain Ahab lost his leg to a whale, and he spends the whole of a book trying to kill the whale in revenge, which is pretty insane. But it does make for a fantastic book. I would also like to mention to you The Harpy, which is a kind of obsession with revenge. So, harpies are mythological creatures who wreak vengeance on others. And in this book, there is a heroine whose husband cheats on her, and she decides that she's going to get her revenge by cheating on her husband in a kind of exactly parallel way to the way that he cheated on her. And it's pretty peculiar and a fun read, and very kind of sharply, precisely, and scarily written. So this is a book that's an obsession with revenge, and I think it's an interesting one to bring into the mix when you're thinking about obsessions. Another different kind of obsession, which is a book that I love, is this one, Fabulous Nobodies by Lee Tulloch, which is all about an obsession with clothes and clothing. It's about a girl who works at a nightclub. She is the person that lets people in or refuses to let them in, depending on what they're wearing. And she's completely obsessed with clothes and the way that clothes go together. It's set in the 1980s. And she's so obsessed with clothes that she actually gives her clothes names. So each of her dresses has a name like Delilah or Bella or Jane. And they are her constant friends and companions. She's fully obsessed and she goes through quite a lot of dramas with her clothes. It's quite a cult like book. It's kind of strange and there's not a lot of mega drama in it, but it's a really good read and it's all about an obsession with clothes. So anyone who does love clothes will definitely really enjoy that book. Another book which is about an obsession but not a love obsession is the very well known Perfume by Patrick Suskind, which is all about an obsession with perfume. If anyone here hasn't read this, it's an amazing read. And you might be put off because you probably will have heard that the hero Grenouille, who is obsessed with perfume, is also a serial killer. So it does have a very dark side. But it's not a kind of serial killer type book in a way because it's just so brilliantly fantastically written. And it's not like a thriller, it's a very thought provoking, interesting, philosophically written kind of book. I'll just read you a bit from the back if you don't know it. In 18th century France, there lived a man who was one of the most gifted and abominable personages in an era that knew no lack of gifted and abominable personages. His name was Jean Baptiste Grenouille, and if his name has been forgotten today, it's certainly not because Grenouille fell short of those more famous blackguards when it came to arrogance, misanthropy, immorality, or, more succinctly, wickedness, but because his gifts and his sole ambition were restricted to a domain that leaves no traces in history, to the fleeting realm of scent. This is a fantastic tale of murder and twisted eroticism, controlled by a disgusted loathing of humanity. Clever, stylish, absorbing, and well worth reading. It is disturbing. It is quite a grim book, but it is fantastic and a really great read. Morgan, if you're still there, this is your book, and I'm hoping you're going to read it soon. Uh, Moving on to Bruce Chatwin. This is his book, Utz, which tells the story of a man obsessed by porcelain. It's very small, it's a little novella. Bruce Chatwin is an amazing writer. I'm sure that lots of you will know of his other books, such as Songlines, which is all about the Aborigines of Australia. And this is a novel shortlisted for the 1988 Booker Prize, and it basically describes the life of a man who is completely obsessed with porcelain in all its forms. And he has a collection of porcelain that he keeps in his flat. And he can't leave his flat for too long because he's too obsessed with keeping the porcelain safe. And he basically is thinking of obsession. We've got to mention Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca because the heroine in the novel, who's never given a name, is obsessed with the dead Rebecca, who was her predecessor, the previous Mrs. De Winter. And the heroine of the book is completely obsessed with Rebecca. She's dying to know all about her. She wants to know about her, and she also wants to um, she kind of wants to be her. So that is an absolutely fantastic read, one which I talk about quite often. Uh, Now, Justine, you're saying a book that I read called It Ends With Us talks about obsession. I loved it. Thank you for that. Was that the Colleen Hoover book? I think that is. It ends with us, um, which I haven't read, but I have heard a lot about, and I definitely want to read it. So thank you for that. That is a good one, and I'd love to know more about it. So I should go and read it. Um, I also wanted to mention, going back to books about love obsessions, Notes on a Scandal by Zoe Heller, which is a really interesting book about a forbidden affair between a teacher and a student, which is at the centre of the novel. The deeper infatuation portrayed here is the platonic one between friends, which is also in the book. When a flighty pottery teacher, Sheba, gives in to an ill-advised sexual obsession with a teenager, disaster inevitably follows. We see Sheba through the eyes of her confidant and colleague, Barbara. Heller deftly explores the ways a close friendship can slide from codependence into something toxic and twisted. Um, there's another interesting book which I haven't read, but I love the sound of, which was recommended to me by someone on Twitter, called Willful Disregard by Lena Anderson, which is a book with a female protagonist looking at sexual fixation with a woman's gaze. Esther is well read and intellectual, but all her philosophizing can't ease the hopelessness of her crush on a mercurial artist. I read Willful Disregard, says this reviewer, full of both agonized secondhand embarrassment and admiration for Anderson's crisp prose. Esther is maddening, lovable, and recognizable to anyone who's ever had a day ruined by an unanswered text message. And I bet there's a lot of you out there in that state. Misery by Stephen King is another story of obsession. Don't know if any of you have read that or seen the film, but that takes the idea of a harmless, generally harmless trait, somebody being a bookworm, and turns it into a blood-curdling obsession. Annie Wilkes imprisons and tortures an author, hoping to create a better end for her favourite heroine. There's a slyness to Stephen King's portrait of Annie, because many of us have obsessed over a beloved character and been upset with what the author has done to that character. But not many people have taken action into their own hands like Annie does in Misery. And apparently Stephen King was partly inspired to write Misery because of his fans' vocal outcry when he attempted a different genre other than horror. But also I bet he's had quite a few people stalking him and being obsessed with him and his characters in his life. So, couple more that I would love to mention, and do bring your suggestions to the fore as well. Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. That is a story of obsession which is like no other. It's about an older man's obsession with a 12-year-old girl. It's written in such a voice that it's incredibly compelling, and one fully enters into the mind of Humbert Humbert. But the obsession itself is obviously deeply disturbing. A different kind of obsession is written about in a book called The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which is, it begins with a woman who starts abstaining from eating meat, and she grows gaunt and distant as she slowly eats less and less. And it's never really explained quite what's going on in her mind. It's a very haunting and worrying book. Her family's concern becomes invasive when they attempt to force feed her. At first, Kang's fever dream of a novella seemed a bit like a typical eating disorder narrative, but it slowly becomes more and more strange because the heroine, Yong Hai's odd behaviour, spreads like a virus. Her brother-in-law becomes dangerously fixated on Yong Hai's birthmark, and there are various different obsessions in the book which are dreamlike, and there's a strange primal sense of inevitability that the whole family is going to slowly unravel. That's The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which is a strange and very slim novel. Another really interesting book, which was also recommended to me by a follower on Instagram, is The Possessions by Sarah Flannery Murphy, which is a story about a woman called Eurydice, Edie, who works as a body for the Elysian Society, a private business that reunites paying clients with their deceased loved ones, which all sounds quite sinister, by donning items that once belonged to the dead and swallowing a pill called a lotus. Edie slips into a state akin to being unconscious, while her body is overtaken by a dead person's spirit. Her latest client, Patrick Braddock, wishes to speak with his deceased wife, Sylvia. Edie obliges, but the more she gives her body over to Sylvia, the blurrier the line between their two lives becomes. So that's a bit of a sci-fi type idea that these people work as bodies and their bodies get taken over by the spirit of a dead person so that the loved one of the dead person can still feel like they're with them, which is a pretty crazy idea, but kind of fun and intriguing. That's The Possessions by Sarah Flannery Murphy, and definitely one to discover if you haven't already. Donatella, thank you for suggesting a fantastic book, which now I've suddenly lost the title. Oh no, what was it called? It was the winner of Le Prix Renaudot 2015. Donatella, are you there? Darn, I can't easily look it up either. So it's a French book. Uh, Damn it, why have I not written it down? That's so annoying. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Hopefully it's going to come back to me any minute now. Donatella, if you're there, quickly put it on the messages. So another one, also suggested by Donatella, is Mrs. March, which is a fantastic looking novel that I also haven't yet read, but love the look of. It's by Virginia Fato, and that is described as 21st century Patricia Highsmith, in which Virginia Fato conjures the unforgettable Mrs. March, an Upper East Side housewife whose life is shattered by her husband's latest novel. Sounds really interesting. In this astonishing debut, the venerable but gossipy New York literary scene is twisted into a claustrophobic funhouse of paranoia, horror, and wickedly dark humour. George March's latest novel is a smash. No one is prouder than Mrs. March, his doting wife. But one morning, the shopkeeper of her favourite patisserie suggests that his protagonist is based on Mrs. March herself. But isn't she? Mrs. March leaned in and, in almost a whisper, said, "A whore." Clutching her ostrich leather pocketbook, she flees that one casual remark, destroying her belief that she knew everything about her husband as well as herself. Suddenly, Mrs. March is hurled into a harrowing journey that builds to near psychosis, one that begins merely within the pages of a book, but may uncover both a killer and the long buried secrets of her past. So that's Mrs. March, which does indeed sound like a fantastic book by Virginia Fato. And Laughing John, thank you for the suggestion of Dorian Gray, which is another book about obsession and a good thought, because it's an obsession with staying young and never dying. So I found, thanks for that, John. I found the book that I was looking for, suggested by Donatella, which is called Based on a True Story by Delphine de Vigan. And this is a book about a woman who is overwhelmed. It's another book about novels, Overwhelmed by the huge success of her latest novel, exhausted and suffering from a crippling inability to write, Delphine meets Elle. So this book is called Based on a True Story. That's translated from the French. Elle embodies everything Delphine has always secretly admired. She's a glittering image of feminine sophistication and spontaneity, and she has an uncanny knack of always saying the right thing. Unusually intuitive, Elle senses Delphine's vulnerability and slowly but deliberately carves herself a niche in the writer's life. However, as Elle makes herself indispensable to Delphine, the intensity of this unexpected friendship manifests itself in increasingly sinister ways. As their lives become more and more entwined, Elle threatens Delphine's identity, both as a writer and as an individual. This sophisticated psychological thriller skillfully blurs the line between fact and fiction, reality and artifice. Delphine de Vigan has crafted a terrifying, insidious, metafictional thriller, a haunting vision of seduction and betrayal, a book which, in its hungering for truth, implicates the reader too, even as it holds us in its thrall. So that is Based on a True Story by Delphine de Vigan, recommended by Donatella. Thank you very much. I love the sound of that, and I'm definitely going to read it. So one last obsessive author that I would like to mention is John Donne, who writes absolutely brilliantly about love. He's the ultimate obsessive poet. I'm a massive fan of his and have been ever since I was at school, and was also recently reignited in my love for him by reading Catherine Rundell's fantastic book all about him called Super Infinite, which reminded me of quite how much I love him. So I'm just going to read you one of his poems. I do love all his poems, and he's great at writing about obsessive love in terms of God and women and sex. Don't know if he does any other obsessions. I think that's probably the main ones. A fever. Oh, do not die, for I shall hate all women so when thou art gone, that thee I shall not celebrate when I remember thou wast one. But yet thou canst not die, I know, to leave this world behind is death. But when thou from this world wilt go, the whole world vapours with thy breath. Or if when thou, the world's soul, goest, it stay, 'tis but thy carcass then, the fairest woman but thy ghost, but corrupt worms, the worthiest men. O wrangling schools that search what fire shall burn this world, had none the wit unto this knowledge to aspire, that this her fever might be it? And yet she cannot waste by this, nor long bear this torturing wrong, for much corruption needful is to fuel such a fever long. Those burning fits but meteors be, whose matter in thee is soon spent. Thy beauty and all parts which are thee are unchangeable firmament. Yet 'twas of my mind seizing thee, though it in thee cannot persevere, for I had rather owner be of thee 1 hour than all else ever. That's pretty epic, isn't it? That is John Donne. He's basically saying he'd be with her for just an hour and then he can die. He is an intense and amazing poet. So, on that happy poetic note, I'm going to leave this session. Do check out more John Donne because I do think he's fantastic. Thanks so much for all your thoughts this evening, and thanks for sending in your suggestions on Instagram, etc. Do let me know if you have any other books about obsession that you want to tell me about. I'd love to know. Send me a message on Instagram or on email, elabear2.com, or on Threads, or on X, which is what used to be Twitter. It's all very confusing. And don't forget, you can always book a bibliotherapy session with me. I'm going to be doing a session soon with Antoine Laurent, who I think is here this evening. Very much looking forward to that. We don't yet have the date totally confirmed. I think it's going to be in February. And also, Finn Horner was here earlier. I'm going to be doing a session about what to read when skiing. what to read literally on the slopes. And that's going to be in March when Finn will be skiing. We might be able to do a bit of a live session from the slope itself. That might be tricky though, because of the timing. I don't know if he can ski and read in the dark. We might just have to talk about it. So thanks so much for coming, everyone, tonight. I will see you all next week. Good night.